The mist clings to the earth like a shroud, obscuring the boundary between land and sky. Through this veil, dark silhouettes emerge, men carrying weapons unlike anything the Saxon defenders have faced before. The ground trembles beneath the coordinated footfalls of Viking warriors, their distinctive axes catching what little light filters through the fog. This moment would fundamentally alter the course of warfare in Anglo-Saxon England. A transformation written in blood and steel that would reshape the military landscape of an entire era. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The world before the Viking incursions was one of fragile stability. Across the fractured landscape of Saxon England, petty kingdoms maintained an uneasy peace, their military tactics largely unchanged for generations. The 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, competed for dominance in a constantly shifting political landscape. Their society was hierarchical, structured around bonds of loyalty between lords and their warriors, known as thanes. These thanes formed the backbone of Saxon military power, professional fighters supported by the agricultural surplus generated by peasant farmers. The Saxon warrior culture revolved around the shield wall, a defensive formation where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable barrier. Behind this wall, they wielded spears as their primary weapons, thrusting at enemies from relative safety. Swords, expensive and status-laden, were carried mainly by elite warriors and nobility. The formation was disciplined, methodical, and effective against traditional enemies who fought in similar ways. This approach to warfare reflected deeper cultural values, community solidarity, order, and hierarchical structure. Archaeological finds from pre-Viking Anglo-Saxon burial sites tell us much about their military equipment. Round shields constructed of lime or alder wood, reinforced with leather facing and iron bosses, provided reasonable protection against the weapons of their era. Their spears, typically around 6 to 7 feet in length with leaf-shaped iron heads, were designed for both thrusting and throwing. The pattern-welded swords carried by elites were prestigious objects, often passed down through generations and given names like living things. But far to the north, across the cold waters of the North Sea, a different warrior culture had been developing in isolation. The Norse people, whom we now call Vikings, inhabited the rugged fjords and valleys of Scandinavia. Their society was shaped by harsh terrain and limited agricultural land, forcing innovation and adaptation. Long winters and short growing seasons created pressure for alternative sources of wealth. The Vikings developed a unique relationship with the sea, viewing it not as a barrier, but as a highway. Their ships became extensions of their identity, vessels that could navigate both deep oceans and shallow rivers with equal facility. The distinctive Viking longship represented a quantum leap in naval technology. With a shallow draft that allowed access to beaches and rivers, a flexible hull that could ride ocean waves, and both sail and oar propulsion, these vessels gave the Norse unprecedented mobility. A longship could carry up to 60 warriors, their weapons, and supplies, depositing them directly onto an undefended shore before anyone knew they had arrived. This mobility would prove devastating when combined with their approach to combat. The Viking warrior was forged in this unforgiving landscape. Unlike the Saxons, who relied primarily on agricultural surplus to support professional fighters, Norse society expected all free men to be capable warriors. Their training began early and continued throughout life, creating a society where combat skills were valued alongside farming and craftsmanship. The harsh environment of Scandinavia, where survival often depended on hunting and fishing skills, produced men with excellent hand-eye coordination and physical strength, attributes that translated directly to battlefield effectiveness. Sagas and archaeological evidence suggest that Viking combat training emphasized individual skill rather than formation fighting. Wrestling, weapons practice, and competitive games honed their abilities from youth. The warrior ideal celebrated in their poetry valued quick reflexes, situational awareness, and the ability to seize opportunities in the chaos of battle, a stark contrast to the Saxon emphasis on maintaining formation discipline. At the heart of the Viking military advantage was their revolutionary approach to weaponry. While Saxon warriors primarily wielded spears and swords as their main armaments, the Vikings had perfected a different weapon, the axe. Not the simple wood-cutting tool familiar to farmers, but a specialized weapon with a crescent-shaped blade carefully balanced for both power and control. These axes came in various forms: the bearded axe with its distinctive downward extending cutting edge that could hook an opponent's shield, the broad axe with its wide blade capable of devastating strikes, and the infamous Dane axe, a two-handed weapon with reach comparable to a spear, but with far greater striking power. The physics of the Viking axe gave it advantages that would prove decisive on the battlefield. The weight distribution concentrated mass at the head, creating a pendulum effect that generated tremendous force even with relatively modest exertion. A skilled Viking warrior could deliver strikes capable of splitting shields or severing limbs, all while maintaining better control than might be expected from such a powerful weapon. The axe's design also allowed for different fighting techniques. It could be swung in wide arcs to create space, used with precision to target vulnerable points, or even thrown with deadly accuracy as a ranged weapon when necessary. The manufacturing process behind these weapons reflected Norse craftsmanship at its finest. Blacksmiths would forge the cutting edge from high-carbon steel, while the body of the axe head might use softer iron for durability and weight. This technique, similar to that used in their swords, created weapons that maintained a sharp edge while resisting breakage. The wooden handles, usually ash or oak, were carefully selected for straight grain and absence of knots, then shaped for optimal grip and balance. The result was a weapon that represented a significant investment of resources and skill, practical tools of war rather than mere status symbols. The heathens came with their axes and hacked through everything before them, records the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, capturing the terror these weapons inspired. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavated Saxon remains from battlefields show distinctive injuries, clean shears through bone that could only have been inflicted by the concentrated force of an axe blow. The psychological impact of seeing comrades suffer such devastating wounds cannot be overstated. These weapons were not merely tools of war. They were perfectly adapted to the Viking style of combat. The social factors driving Viking expansion are complex and often misunderstood. Climate shifts in the late 8th century created population pressures as agricultural productivity in Scandinavia declined. Political consolidation under ambitious kings like Harald Fairhair of Norway pushed out rivals and their followers, creating bands of warriors with nothing to lose. Trade networks revealed the wealth available in less defended communities around the North Sea and beyond. Monasteries, with their concentrations of precious metals in the form of religious artifacts, presented particularly tempting targets. All these forces combined to launch what historians now call the Viking Age. The initial raids on coastal monasteries were primarily resource-gathering expeditions, but they revealed critical weaknesses in Saxon defensive preparations. The Vikings, with their superior naval technology, could strike anywhere along the coast or up navigable rivers, then disappear before an effective response could be mobilized. This mobility forced the Saxons to disperse their forces, creating opportunities for Vikings to engage Saxon warriors on favorable terms. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin wrote that never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. This terror was magnified by the seeming inability of local forces to respond effectively. Traditional Saxon military organization, based on mobilizing forces through a hierarchical system, was simply too slow to counter the hit-and-run tactics of the Viking raiders. When these forces finally met in pitched battle, the differences in their fighting styles became starkly apparent. Saxon warriors, trained in the disciplined shield wall, found themselves facing opponents who refused to follow the expected patterns of engagement. The Viking combat approach emphasized individual skill combined with small unit tactics. Rather than meeting the shield wall head-on, Viking warriors would probe for weaknesses, feint to create openings, and strike with devastating power when gaps appeared. The axe proved instrumental in these tactics. A sword could be caught on a shield's rim, but the axe's curved blade could hook behind a shield, pulling it down or aside. The two-handed Dane axe could strike over the shield wall, threatening the heads and shoulders of defenders. Even more devastating was the axe's ability to damage the shields themselves. Contemporary accounts describe how Viking axes could split Saxon shields, rendering them useless and creating gaps in the defensive line that could be exploited. One particularly decisive encounter occurred at the Battle of Reading in 871. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how a Viking force engaged a larger Saxon army led by Ethelwulf Ilderman of Berkshire. The Saxons initially held formation, but the sustained Viking assault on their shield wall, primarily using axes to destroy shields and create openings, eventually forced a collapse. Once the Saxon formation broke, the slaughter was terrible, with Ethelwulf himself among the fallen. The Danes fought with fury unknown to Christian men, writes a monastic chronicler, their axes rising and falling like the hammers of smiths, breaking shields and the bodies beneath them alike. This description captures not just the physical reality of Viking combat, but the psychological impact it had on their opponents. The Norse warriors brought another innovation to these encounters, their distinctive armor, or often their lack of it. While Saxon elites fought in mail shirts that offered good protection but limited mobility, many Viking fighters wore lighter protection that allowed for greater speed and endurance. Archaeological evidence suggests that while some Viking leaders and wealthy warriors did possess mail armor, many relied primarily on their shields for protection, supplemented perhaps by leather jerkins or padded gambesons. This difference reflected their tactical approach. They sought not to absorb blows behind shields, but to strike first and decisively. Their fighting style emphasized offensive action rather than the defensive posture preferred by Saxon forces. The berserker phenomenon, while often exaggerated in later accounts, had some basis in reality. These warriors, possibly associated with the cult of Odin, would enter battle in a state of focused frenzy, less concerned with self-protection than with breaking enemy formations. Whether achieved through ritual, self-induced psychological states, or consumption of substances like the hallucinogenic fly agaric mushroom, as some theories suggest, the effect was to produce fighters who showed little fear and attacked with unusual ferocity. Against the ordered ranks of Saxon defenders, such unpredictable aggression proved deeply unsettling. The psychological dimension of these confrontations cannot be overstated. Viking warriors cultivated an intimidating presence enhanced by unfamiliar weapons, foreign battle cries, and reports of their earlier successes. Contemporary Christian accounts often attribute supernatural qualities to these northern invaders, describing them as possessed of demonic strength or immunity to pain. While these are clearly exaggerations, they reflect the psychological advantage the Vikings held over their opponents. This advantage was reinforced by the Viking belief system. While Christianity had taken root among the Saxons, bringing with it certain constraints on warfare, the Norse warriors followed a religious tradition that glorified combat. Their concept of Valhalla, a hall where the honorably slain would feast with Odin, until called to fight in the final battle of Ragnarok, created a warrior ethos that minimized fear of death. As recorded in the much later Heimskringla, Odin's followers were said to go into battle without mailcoats, wild as dogs or wolves, biting their shields, strong as bears or bulls, killing men at a blow, and neither fire nor iron could bring them down. While poetically embellished, such accounts capture a fundamental difference in the cultural approaches to warfare. The impact of these battlefield innovations was profound. Saxon kingdoms were forced to adapt or perish. Some chose to pay the Vikings off with silver, the infamous Danegeld, buying temporary peace at the cost of financing future invasions. Others attempted to improve their own military capabilities, incorporating elements of Viking tactics and weaponry. King Alfred of Wessex, who would later earn the epithet the Great, recognized the need for systematic change. After suffering defeats and being driven into hiding in the Somerset marshes, Alfred emerged with a new approach to countering the Viking threat. He reorganized his kingdom's defenses, establishing a network of fortified burhs, fortresses, strategically placed so that no settlement was more than a day's march from safety. He created a standing army, the third that could respond more quickly to Viking incursions, with half the force remaining on duty, while the other half tended their lands. Most importantly, he commissioned the construction of a new type of ship, longer, faster, and higher-sided than the Viking vessels, giving the Saxons the ability to intercept raiders before they could land. Archaeological evidence reveals how Saxon warriors began adopting the axe as a primary weapon during this period of adaptation. Burial sites from the late 9th and early 10th centuries show a marked increase in axe heads accompanying warrior graves, suggesting a tactical shift inspired by their northern adversaries. The Saxon axe never fully replaced the sword as a status symbol, but it became an essential part of the warrior's arsenal. The type of axe they favored tended to be slightly heavier than the Viking versions, perhaps reflecting their stronger emphasis on breaking through armor rather than manipulating shields. The chronicles and sagas that record these conflicts offer fascinating insights into how each side viewed the other. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled during King Alfred's reign, portrays the Vikings as a divine punishment for the sins of the English people while simultaneously recognizing their martial prowess. The Norse sagas, written down centuries later but preserving older oral traditions, depict the English as wealthy but soft, defended by warriors who fought bravely but lacked the fierce spirit of northern fighters. These sources, when combined with archaeological evidence, allow us to reconstruct specific battles where the axe proved decisive. The Battle of Ashdown in 871, where the future King Alfred first distinguished himself, saw Viking forces initially gain advantage before a Saxon counterattack drove them from the field. Excavations at suspected battle sites have unearthed broken shield bosses with distinctive damage patterns consistent with axe strikes, telling the story of the fight in the language of damaged metal. The dynamics of these battles were complex. Viking forces typically preferred to fight on ground of their choosing, ideally with their backs to water to protect their ships and provide an escape route if needed. They would form a defensive line called a skjaldborg shield castle, similar in some ways to the Saxon shield wall, but more flexible. From this formation, individual warriors or small groups would launch attacks aimed at breaking the opposing line. When facing a Saxon shield wall, the primary target was the integrity of the formation itself. Once gaps appeared, the wall's strength was compromised. This tactic is vividly described in the Anglo-Saxon poem The Battle of Maldon, which recounts a clash between Vikings and Saxons in 991 CE. Though written later, it preserves details of Viking fighting methods. The seafarers wanted to advance, the warriors to the battle. Ordered then a war-hardened warrior that each man should free his hand. Think of deeds of arms. This emphasis on individual action within a coordinated framework characterizes the Viking approach to combat. As the seasons turned and raids gave way to conquest and settlement, The military balance continued to evolve. The establishment of the Danelaw, the region of England under Viking control, created a blended military tradition. Norse settlers married into Saxon families, creating a hybrid culture with elements of both martial traditions. The resulting warriors were formidable indeed, combining Saxon discipline with Viking aggression and innovation. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 CE marked a turning point in this evolution. No longer content with raiding, the Vikings sought conquest and settlement. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, according to saga tradition, this force was larger and more organized than previous raiding parties. Its success in conquering Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia demonstrated the effectiveness of Viking military methods on a strategic as well as tactical level. The weapon technology continued to develop as well. By the mid-10th century, the Dane axe had evolved into an even more formidable weapon. Axe heads from this period show refinement in both materials and design, with improved balance and durability. The typical Dane axe now featured a crescent-shaped blade up to 30 centimeters, 12 inches, from top to bottom, mounted on a shaft approximately 1.5 meters, 5 feet in length. The long handle provided tremendous leverage, allowing a strong warrior to deliver blows capable of penetrating mail armor. The effectiveness of these weapons is recorded in contemporary accounts of battles throughout the late Viking Age. At the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, fought in Ireland between the forces of Brian Boru and a Viking-Irish alliance, axes feature prominently in the descriptions of combat. The 12th century text, Kogad Gaidhel Regalaiv, the War of the Irish with the foreigners, describes how there was a wood of axes rising over their heads and death upon the edges of their weapons. This military transformation had lasting consequences for European warfare. The axe remained a significant battlefield weapon for centuries, with variants appearing throughout the medieval period. The Danish huscarls, who formed the elite corps of King Knuth's Anglo-Danish regime, were famous for their use of the two-handed axe. When Harold Godwinson became King of England, he maintained this military tradition with his own huscarl bodyguard, who would make their last stand with their axes at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The Vikings' emphasis on mobility and offensive action influenced military thinking well beyond their era. Even the Norman conquest of England in 1066 showed the legacy of these innovations. The Normans themselves descended from Norse settlers in France, bringing an evolved version of Viking tactics to bear against the Anglo-Saxon forces at Hastings. The famous Bayeux Tapestry clearly depicts Saxon warriors wielding large axes against Norman cavalry, a testament to how thoroughly this weapon had been adopted into English military culture. The tactical revolution pioneered by Viking Axemen extended beyond the weapon itself to encompass a broader shift in fighting philosophy. While traditional European warfare had emphasized holding ground through solid formations, the Vikings demonstrated the effectiveness of mobility, targeted strikes, and psychological warfare. These concepts would be further developed by later medieval commanders, culminating in the dynamic battlefield tactics of the High Medieval period. As winter snow gives way to spring melt, so too did the Viking Age eventually recede. Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, moderating the warrior ethos that had driven expansion. Political consolidation created larger, more stable kingdoms with less need for foreign adventure. The tactical advantages that had made Viking warriors so formidable were adopted by their former victims, leveling the military playing field. Yet the legacy of the axe-wielding Viking warrior endured. In museums across Europe, carefully preserved weapons tell the story of this military revolution. Axe heads, their edges still showing the pattern-welded steel that made them so effective, rest alongside broken Saxon shields bearing the scars of their impact. These silent artifacts speak to a moment when one weapon and the warriors who wielded it changed the course of warfare in medieval Europe. The axe continued to evolve as a weapon long after the Viking Age had passed. The pole axe of the late medieval period, combining an axe blade with a hammerhead and spike, shows clear design influences from the earlier Dane axe. Even the English bill and halberd, which would prove so effective against French knights during the Hundred Years' War, owe something to the Viking innovation of mounting a cutting blade on a long shaft to maximize leverage and striking power. The tactical lessons learned during the Viking incursions influenced military thinking for generations. The importance of mobility, the value of specialized weapons for specific battlefield roles, and the effectiveness of targeting enemy formations rather than individual warriors. All these concepts found their way into the military manuals and training practices of later medieval kingdoms. When Edward I of England faced Scottish schiltron formations in the late 13th century, the tactics his forces employed showed echoes of the methods Viking warbands had used against Saxon shield walls 400 years earlier. In our modern world, far removed from the blood-soaked battlefields of Saxon England, the Viking warrior still captures the imagination. Not for the violence they unleashed, but for what they represent: innovation, adaptation, and the capacity to challenge established systems with new approaches. The lesson of the Viking Axemen is not about destruction, but disruption. How a single innovation, perfectly adapted to its purpose and wielded with skill and determination, can fundamentally alter the balance of power. When we look beyond the simplified images of horned helmets, which Vikings never actually wore in battle, and bloodthirsty raiders, we find a more nuanced and instructive history. The Vikings were certainly capable of terrible violence, but they were also master craftsmen, explorers, merchants, and settlers. Their military innovations reflect a broader cultural willingness to question conventions and find new solutions to challenges. In this capacity for adaptation and innovation, perhaps, lies their most enduring legacy. The mist that shrouded those ancient battlefields has long since lifted, but the echo of the Viking axe continues to resonate through history, a reminder that advantage in conflict often goes not to the largest force or the wealthiest kingdom, but to those willing to reimagine the rules of engagement. When Saxon warriors first faced the fury of Viking axemen, they witnessed not just a new weapon, but a new conception of warfare, one that would transform their world and echo through the centuries that followed.